This is the lesson video for lesson 2.08, Evidence for Evolution, Part 2. The theory of evolution states that an organism's characteristics, including its DNA sequence, so when we talk about the DNA sequence, we're talking about the bases, arose from similar characteristics in the organism's ancestors. So remember, if we have similar characteristics between two organisms, we can say that they probably have some sort of common ancestor. By examining evidence from fossils and shared characteristics, such as like different structures, scientists infer that living things on Earth had common ancestors. Again, if they have common characteristics, then we can say that they probably came from the same ancestor. So even though we have really revolutionary scientists like Charles Darwin, who really looked at evolution, specifically natural selection, closely, they didn't really have access to all of the different information that we have now about genes and how things work chemically inside of our bodies. And so they weren't able to have a genetic basis for evolution. All they did was observe. Right, but we're able to look into DNA. So today scientists look at DNA sequences and compare those sequences with other data to prove evolution and how organisms have changed over time. So here's the basis of what we're going to be talking about today. If an organism has similar enzymes, right, which are types of protein, then they must have similar genes, since proteins come from genes. And if they have similar genes, then that means that they probably have some sort of common ancestor. Okay, so shared characteristics among species, types of bones, body plans, or even enzymes are evidence suggesting different species had a common ancestor at some point in their history. So again, shared characteristics obviously mean that you can look all the way back to their DNA to realize that because they have similarities in their DNA, they probably had a common ancestor. So you probably don't think that you have much in common with this bread mold, but in fact, there is an enzyme that we both have called cytochrome C. And cytochrome C, what it does in both of our bodies, or in both organisms, is that it helps us obtain energy from food. So obviously this is a very vital characteristic for survival, right? So because it allows organisms to survive, it must have played the same role in our common ancestor and was maintained in all organisms even today. Cytochrome C is found actually in all eukaryotes, so it is likely that it was found also in the common ancestor or the first eukaryotic organism. And the reason for that, again, is because cytochrome C is so important for an organism's survival that it really hasn't changed over the years. Okay, so how exactly do we compare DNA sequences, and why do we even compare DNA sequences? So remember, if we see that two organisms or a lot of different species have similar proteins, then that again can tell us something about DNA. And why is that? It's because proteins, remember, are made from the code from RNA. And RNA, again, is made from DNA. Remember, this process is called transcription, and then this process here is called translation. Okay, so remember, each of the protein has amino acids, and each amino acid is coded by a codon in the RNA, which originated from the DNA. So again, DNA is the starting point. So again, if we have similar DNA, we can then possibly come up with a common ancestor for all these organisms. Okay. Also, we can look at the sequence DNA to figure out how closely related different groups of animals are. So if their sequences are more similar, then that means they must be more closely related. For example, there are actually only 3 differences in amino acids between the cytochrome C of a pig, right, and a dog, right? There are only 3 differences. So we see here that they're actually pretty closely related, with this being their common ancestor. But this thing right here is actually not as related, right? It's further away from the pig and the dog, and that's because the pig and this right here, which is actually yeast, right, have 45 differences between the two, and so they're going to be further away on this phylogenetic tree. So speaking of phylogenetic trees, we can use them in order to map out kind of the relationships and how closely related certain organisms are. And so again, this tree represents similarities in the cytochrome C amino acid sequences. So specifically here, this is the phylogenetic tree for cytochrome C, okay? And so we see here that at each of these would be considered, at each of these nodes, we would have common ancestors, okay, for each one. And how we read this is basically, if they have the more recent a common ancestor is between the 2 organisms, the more closely related. So we see that a human and a monkey are actually very closely related. They have a recent common ancestor. But if we were to look at humans and let's say a chicken, right? Their most recent common ancestor would be this one right here. And so this common ancestor was a lot longer ago than this one right here, so we would say that the monkey and human are more closely related than the human and the chicken. Another important point is that molecules actually change at different rates. So cytochrome C, what it really does is it plays a role in cellular respiration. Remember, it helps organisms obtain energy from food. And this is a very basic function, something that is basic, a basic function for survival. Basically, without it, organisms would not be able to make ATP, which is necessary for survival. So if you were to change the cytochrome C just a little bit via a mutation, it would usually cause the organism to die. So any changes to this gene usually cause some sort of fatal result. And that's why the cytochrome C really has preserved its sequence over time, and that's why we're able to compare it even today. So even though the cytochrome C has not changed much, there are some changes that have occurred, and it occurred at a very constant rate, which means that the changes in the bases that are in the cytochrome C gene changes at the same rate. So it's like a certain amount of nucleotides that were changed every so many years. And so for that reason, a lot of scientists use the cytochrome C as a molecular clock. They could see how much has the cytochrome C sequence changed, and then they can determine how long ago this organism could have been alive, or when they could have diverged from one another. Okay, so if we're looking at a summary of this lesson, again, this is the second one for the evidence of evolution. In this lesson, we just looked at DNA comparisons, how we can look at DNA sequences. And the reason why, remember, we can look at DNA is because it gives us insight on what type of protein. So if we look at the proteins, we can then say, wow, if they have similar proteins, they must have similar DNA sequences, which must mean that they have a common ancestor. So because of that, it provides evidence for evolution, because it tells us a little bit about common ancestors. it tells you the relationships among organisms, so we can figure out when was one organism, or how closely related is one organism than to another, right? And it can be used as a molecular clock, because remember, for the cytochrome C, it changes at a very constant rate, and so we can use things like DNA sequences to estimate when certain events have occurred. So here's some important vocabulary that you need to know. Amino acids, remember, they are the smaller units of a protein. Okay, so if this whole thing was a protein, then each of these right here would be an amino acid. Okay, and they are coded for in the RNA and DNA. Oops. And then another one to review is phylogenetic tree, which, remember, shows that the evolutionary relationships between different organisms.